from you. I have no idea. Okay. Okay. So welcome to our fourth session of the that will be Being in Time, and Derrida's first published work in any case, his long introduction and translation to The Origin of Geometry, which is an appendix to Husserl's last work, The Crisis of European Sciences. At the rate we're going, we're at section 4 of 83 sections of 2 divisions of Being in Time. And today's section is a bit shorter. I'm going to actually start with Being in Time instead of starting with the Derrida text. But I'm thinking over time, when we get to those longer sections of Being in Time and even the chunkier chapters in Derrida's small text, that we could end up spending several sessions just on one section. So if you do the math, I don't know, there must be a mathematical term for an asymptotic infinite approach to as a curve to some finite line that we're supposed to reach. But we could conceivably go on for a very, very long time just to complete Being in Time. But we'll negotiate that together. I mean, we'll see what kind of pace we want to move. I'm more than happy just to keep going. If we have to spend, for example, there are at least 10 sections I live in terms of Being in Time, and meaning over decades. So you can spend a lifetime just in one area. But the goal is to try to move along and try to have some kind of grasp of the overall work of Being in Time. But this is going to take some time. So let's not put too much pressure on ourselves to go at a rapid pace. I hope that's okay. So today, as I mentioned, we're doing section 4, and let me bring that up in terms of my share. We can all see that. Section 4, the ontological priority of the question of being. And the good news here again is that we're talking about science, just like presumably Derrida via Husserl is questioning in their own way, the historical ontological grounds of sensibility as a set of conditions, not in a Kantian fixed sense, but as somehow linked to a primordial historicity, which we have to get at when we get to Derrida. But here, they're both not questioning science because they're philosophers of science, or they're interested in science as a subject matter that requires philosophical investigation. That's a field by itself. Analytic traditions, one could argue analytic philosophy was born that way. And even the split between Frege, which is also the forerunner of analytic philosophy, and then what Husserl is trying to do. But it's bringing it back to this question of how we even define fundamental ontology.
Yep.
So, which requires a pre-ontological sense and therefore a pre-comprehension. It's just science as a world, science as a world, science with the world that comes with science, science as a world, as opposed to science itself. So this is just a long way of saying that once again, as hard as it is, we have to suspend the subject-object distinction. Like, I'm a subject, there's a brain, some people say, in this skull. And that's inside this body, and presumably there's a world outside me, and there's a relationship between the two, and either I can take this brain and mind and reduce it to some fundamental material substance, which is also in the world. Say after I die, it decomposes and all that's left is a skull. Or I can say a priori that no, even that kind of assumption is a production of sense based on some a priori rules that are transcendental and irreducible to experience, even the experience of myself thinking right now in the world, or using my senses to grasp things. That'll take us back to the Kant route, the Kant breakthrough. But we're going to do none of that right now. It's the reduction for phenomenology, this epochal kind of suspension is the best suggestion I'd say is as hard as it is at some point we're going to get to this idea of being in the world, the facticity of that, the thrownness, the stretchedness of it, the occurrence, us occurring as such, in terms of this relationship between subject and object. But getting rid of circles, the subject becomes an object of itself, or maybe a different type of Hegelian route. Is consciousness of self? Or is it self-consciousness as a thing that he wants to study? It turns out to be the latter, not simply just how am I conscious of myself, thinking and talking and just existing in this body and looking at the time, etc. So there are many ways to break this circle the subject and the object. And it's very hard. The subject produces history and is made by history. Look at the world falling apart right now because of all these crazy people running it. And we can't even do anything about it. On the other hand, we're completely overwhelmed by the acceleration of the madness of the cascading interrelations of all the different types of things that are happening all at once, almost to this point of desensitizing us to some kind of, or deluding us into believing some kind of apocalyptic myth, what some people want to do. But, how can you deny that? And the issue is not solipsism or skepticism or denial of what's happening, denying everything. The issue is getting around binary oppositions. What is the pre-understanding that even allows us to have a sense of a binary? Subject and object. Subject makes history, is being made by history. Creator, biblical creator, the created. You know, and that's where we're at. So we have to get into theory of the relation. And that's at work as a type of movement, which is a very strange thing, not the metaphysical problem of motion in the ancient Greeks, which Heidegger takes up, of course. But Derrida, for his part, too, deference will turn out to be a movement, too. The weird back and forth, because you can't begin with the beginning as an historian to say, oh, yeah, that great genius back there in antiquity, he was the first to come up with the first geometric proof. And then the science was really one before that. People were just kind of like stumbling around, different cultures and civilizations poking here and there, not in contact with each other, but in the ether, there's a series of sedimentations, to use Derrida's word, that then somehow, at some point comes into existence through the subjective act. And Husserl and Derrida on Husserl saying, no, that's not what we're talking about. So similarly here, Heidegger's going to try to undo the circle that he potentially could get trapped in. Okay, the question of the meaning of being, this work here is not going to answer it. That's fundamental ontology. But to really get into the inquirer of this question and in its being, which he'll then name Dasein, don't call it being there or existence. That's moving too soon. Just remember the previous section, the inquirer. But it's a very strange being, unlike any other ontic entities as beings in the world, because its being is an issue for it. And you might think, well, yeah, that's us human beings, right? Because we're finite, we're going to die, the world's falling apart. Those of us that live in the US can't fathom, I'll speak for myself, can't even believe what's happening and who's in control and what decisions are being made. It makes every previous epoch that I can remember. For me, it starts with the 80s and Reagan looked normal. And even that was a terrible time looking back as a kid. So, yeah, how do we understand this idea of being in the world, questioning it as existence, which is now a very tumultuous, tormenting thing? If one were to say, well, we can't even start there, then, geez, like, okay, how are we going to come to some grips of these? If we really use this Derridean type of mindset to really dissect some of these too quick connections Heidegger is making, these relations that he's creating between all these different terms, these distinctions he's offering and then undoing at the same time. A Derridean mindset or lens into this very moment here can do a lot. And we said we're not trying to take a quote unquote Derridean or deconstructive approach. I tend to work that way because that's what I was influenced by. I'm not suggesting you do, but I'm not pretending to give you the truth of this section. So many people said, hey, this is what this is saying, and this is what this means for Heidegger, and this is how the whole thing gets started, and this is it. And I that's not how I work. I like to even almost see this as a literary work, and I'm like a literary critic. I don't know, I'm going to interpret it in so many different ways and just kind of tease out the hidden sort of relationships that are not even being discussed beneath this text. So the or text beneath it. But let's try to understand what some of those, if we're not dealing with that hermeneutic circle of subject and object, we're not thinking about the unity of thought and being, if that's a simplistic reduction of Parmenides. politics according. It's not how I feel about the ancient Greeks. I think their complexity dwarfs, for me, many modern thinkers. But um, to get around this circle of what Dasein is and what the question meaning of being is, what the Dasein analytic is, what fundamental ontology is, what the inquirer of being is, what the being of the inquirer is, what the question is, what a potential answer could be. It's going to turn out to be time, but we're not even there yet. And not linear time, but something more primordial. The relationship between being and time itself. So let me just start reading here this paragraph, if you don't mind. My goal is to, as we do it, try to even suspend some of the Heidegger vocabulary some of us have already been given. The ontological difference in being and beings, ontological and ontic, because it shows up everywhere. Try to look at some other things beneath that. So I'll start here. I'm purposely skipping the first paragraph, even though he talks about one definition of science as the interconnection of true propositions. But this is not the real meaning of science. It's about some inquirer. Sciences have the manner of being which this entity, man himself, possesses. Essentially, we denote by the term Dasein. So just use example physicists as much as they might want to question the Big Bang, have like come out of standard Kuhnian paradigmatic consensus of a Big Bang 13 billion years ago in their calculation of linear time. And everything came out of that seemingly out of nothing. Some people are questioning it now, saying, no, this was the death of an older universe and the birth. But we'll go with what the common one has been around. And all the stuff that's in the universe now that we can observe, matter, energy, galaxy stars, and dead things like black holes or living dead things like them. Everything that exists in the universe, that came after. But that doesn't answer what was there before, obviously, and the whole problem of temporality for Heidegger. So it's interesting that the subject, the physicist, can have that beginning, and then, or a biblical person can say, "Oh, Genesis, yeah, the creator, the earth was without void, it was void and without form. Darkness hovered over the water, and then God said, let there be," and then the first day said, those are those structures. Let's leave them alone. We're not talking about that here because this is fascinating. We're trying to get to the ground of both of those in a way. Ground. Okay, we're not even using the word ground yet, but we're going to get at this entity that questions. We want to know, how do those beings, the biblical person that wants to just sit there and divine the mystery of creation, the event of creation, or the cosmologist who's using all the tools of physics today, string theory and multidimensional spaces and quantum gravity and the event horizon, the singularity of the black hole, the mathematization of that, because that's the only way they can get to that level, by the way. So let's just keep that in mind. They're doing that work, and what good for them. But that's just one mode for this much deeper thing called Dasein. So, meaning that the scientific research is not the only manner this can have. Dasein has special distinctiveness. I know I said I was going to read this, and here I am. Let me just do this quickly. Has a special distinctiveness. Let's just stay there. Okay, so what is that? Let's start reading here. Dasein is an entity which does not just occur. It's almost like Dasein is not a subject or object in the world that will be studied by subjects, but is an occurrence. It stands out in a way. And I hate to do this to you, but you know, again, the Derridean move, trying to read this text now at the beginning from the standpoint of the end, or even what's missing, like the division three, but to just show my cards, to show the cards of Heidegger a bit. The meaning of being Dasein is going to turn out to be temporality. That's going to show up in just shortly in a few other sections, but it's not time as in clocks and calendars or us, birth and death, 55 years old, whatever. And it's not within time, inner Zeitlichkeit. So time is ecstatic because it's an occurrence, it's a relationship. But so we can say it does not occur among other. Rather, he's saying here now, this is good, where certain people, especially analytics, want to tear him apart because he's just confusing things. It's ontically distinguished. Special distinctiveness up there, not just the scientist, not just human beings, and quite frankly, not just human existence. Certainly not God, the creator God of the Abrahamic faiths. But it's ontically distinct the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. Issue, problem, question, trouble, torment, anxiety, an issue. I'm taking issue with it. I got a problem. I got or as we'll get to the death chapters, something that remains to be settled. Death, when he's talking about death, once you annihilate or liquidate whatever is outstanding and no more possibilities, then that might be that kind of like existential idea of death that he's talking about, not biological perishing or like, off flatlined at the hospital after like finally, that's it. Last gasp of air. The issue. But in this case, this constituent state of Dasein's being, this implies that Dasein, in its being, has a relationship towards that being. So there's so much going on here. It looks like a circle. It looks like some relationship between subject and object, but obviously it's not. There's a relation towards being, relationship which itself, the relationship is of being. Dasein being it's a weird being because its being is an issue for it. The it is not a split between a subject and an object. There's a relationship. It's towards the being. The relationship is of being. What's this towards movement, currents, and then this relationship, which isn't, he's not even saying what it is of being. That there is in some way in which Dasein understands itself in its being, that to some extent it does so explicitly. It is peculiar to this entity that with and through its being, this being is disclosed to it. Now that's a lot of assumptions there. That okay, good, this being is not a machine that's turned off, it's receptive, it's open. You know, it's being that's an issue for it, and the question of that is going to be disclosed to it. Not a revelation, not a commandment from the mountain. Okay, this is the being. I am who I am. And I am sent you, Moses. Take this to the world. So it's not that. Understanding being is also a characteristic of Dasein's being. Now here's the punchline. This is where everyone gets hung up. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it's ontological. Okay, you can interpret this to say, let's admit Dasein's an entity. It exists, like with other beings, like my computer. Let's make it distinctive, peculiar, special, unique, because of everything you just said in this paragraph. It's an issue. It's not simply disclosed in the beginning, problem of beginnings. It's not transparent. It's not the problem of being in the first section, universal, necessary. Everybody thinks we need it. What is the verb. We use it in language. We just assume it. And yet, do we even know that we're perplexed by it or don't have an answer for it? No. So I'm going to pose this question anew. The question of meaning being, but the meaning of the question. So Dasein is disclosed. Being is disclosed, but we have to get at this. So this whole project is a precursor to try to answer the question of fundamental ontology. But he's saying here that it's first ontic, and then he quickly shifts to what he calls ontological. The classic distinction of the ontological difference is that there's being and there are beings. Don't bring this being down to the level of beings. It's not present. It's not an object. It's not me thinking, this brain. It's not, my laptop. So don't ever bring that down. And that difference, which Derrida is going to do something with later on, not just with difference, but in his Ussi and Gramé, even that is problematic. Like for when he tries to criticize Heidegger, like setting up this distinction of being and beings. There must be an older difference than even this difference that had to be forgotten when being was collapsed into being, and metaphysics tried to, describe what those beings are. Both those guys, Heidegger and Derrida, are questioning the entire tradition of metaphysics and destroying, deconstructing it because of this collapse of difference. But what's happening here? There's already this kind of like pre-collapse, if you will. But let's give some credit to Heidegger here. Here, being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. So that's kind of like a response back to the later Derrida. He tries to make his critiques of Heidegger. So if we should reserve the term ontology for that theoretical inquiry, which is explicitly devoted to the meaning of entities, then what we have in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is being designated something pre-ontological. So science is not going to give us this answer. Religion is not going to give us this answer. Presidents of democracies, especially this one, is not going to give us the answer. And I'm not going to give you the answer, and you're not going to give me the answer. So what are we doing here? What's going on? But it does not signify simply being ontical, like the entity. You got the understanding of being, you got the disclosure, it's a characteristic of being. Being is an issue for this inquirer. The being of this inquirer is in question. So being of the question is in question. I hate to sound tautological there, but don't jump to like, hey, everyone's just going to give you an answer to the meaning of being. Not because we're relativists or we're anti-tyranny or totalitarianism or some simple way of being anti-metaphysics, whatever people say that is, or postmodern. No, that's not the issue. The issue is this pre-ontological grounding that will give rise to this relationship. So we have a sincere and authentic way into the question about the meaning of being, but take seriously the status of us as the questioner, and then separate that out, not because we want to make human beings great, they're paramount in the creation, but because of some kind of internal necessity. So this is where he comes at this word existence in the next paragraph. That kind of being which does and can comport itself in one way or another, and always does not comport itself somehow, we call existence. Now, for the French crowd that goes off with Sartre, that generation in the 40s, and the birth of existentialism and the nausea of the modern world, or perhaps the Frankfurt School in Germany, Heidegger, as you'll see throughout the rest of the work, is not doing existentialism. It's not the nausea that we're all feeling right now, living in the world, because the world is just terrible. And some of us have always been uncomfortable in our worlds. Like I've never been comfortable in this American neoliberal geistige lack thereof structure that I was born in and raised in and spent my whole life in. So that this whole Heimat is extremely uncanny for me. I just don't relate to it. And yet that's all I know because this is where I was made. So it's not that nausea, and it's not anything else that can fill up ontically what existential angst can look like. So that's going to become a problem for us. Derrida's, the young Derrida is wise enough to pick up with this and run with it. He's not he's dismissing all the ontic registers too. Signifies in his word, attached to signifiers. Um, because we can't define Dasein's essence by citing a what of the kind that pertains to a subject matter. We're throwing this open here. We're not stating anything about the subject matter of Dasein, let alone its being, its quote unquote essence. So just suspend even this thing existence. Because you're going to want to say existence of what? God? Raj? My kids? What? No. Because its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case, it has its being to be and has it as its own. We've chosen again another way of saying to designate this entity as Dasein. What entity? What are we talking about? Not the essence as existence, which people often say is the equation. Essence is existence, but as it purely as an expression of its being. So that's why they don't want to translate it. Being there is spatial. Being there, being here, just being in the world. It evokes all the spatial understandings of entities. It risks being thrown back into the ontic realm. And he's trying to say, look, I just have no other way of saying, how to even name this inquirer or the event of questioning, thinking, later Heidegger. But he does come back here. We'll kind of pause this page and then, sorry, I won't be able to do all this otherwise I'm going to finish my remarks. It is important that we try to discuss the Aristotle Aquinas discussion about the soul, but I can summarize that. You'll have to trust me a bit, or not trust me and say, look, this is wrong, and bring in a different interpretation. But it's important to get at this fundamental distinction so we understand what he's doing. So it's not existentialism in any kind of traditional sense. I'm going to radically try to say it's not human existence either, and that's where people are going to say, no, I don't. We don't trust you. The text is stating itself. It's about us, the human being. Okay, that's fine, but you know, why does he then make further distinctions? And he should have just said the human being, das Mensch or whatever, something. He says this does, and I know, just don't, you know, can't tell you what the subject matter is from the beginning. So we got to get started, and we're going to go down a path, and only after we traverse it are we going to come back to the beginning and say, hey, was this the right way? By the end of the text, he's saying, hey, look, I don't even know if this was the right way. This is the way I took, but you know, Dasein always understands itself in terms of existence. This is about possibility, the possibility of itself to be itself or not itself. Okay, so that will take us into all these other registers eventually about authenticity and care and coming to grips with our own finitude and being resolved and trying to like not just get caught up in everything else, but come back to ourselves, hand down the heritage that was passed down. Him as a thinker, obviously having to reckon the other greats, Plato, Aristotle, eventually Hegel. How did they come at it? So, and then the root of all this is the mystery. It will turn out to be the mystery of time itself, like not just our timing, our finitude, the amount of time we're given in life, but and not the Aristotelian problem of the aporias of time. The past is no longer present, future. You know, the nows connect, but also disconnect. And how can the present be a past version of itself, but also the yet to be future? All the aporias and paradoxes that Heidegger, of course, is spellbound by. Derrida is going to do something with that too. But it's not the metaphysical problems of time. It's the temporalization of our existence, the agglutination, the accumulation of everything and all the sediments, and just still being open to being in the world as opposed to not being in the world, which could look like death. So it's that type of if there are possibilities for us to be ourselves. Now he says, look at this. Dasein has either chosen these possibilities, gotten itself into them, or grown up in them already. Those are somehow like the ecstatic temporal registers already. Already as having been alongside gotten into themselves because you're with everything else that's present at hand, including the Dasman, the general day that draws you in. And, you know, then you feel like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not really, this is not me. I'm not this day, but this day is in me and I can't get rid of them. And it's not authentic. So ultimately, the futural part, which is still out of the two ecstasies, my having been this, I'm in the world with everything else, I can't escape it. So what's that openness to the future that doesn't have any content? If it's still open for me, then I'm still in the world. That's one definition. Honest Dasein is, it's incomplete. It's another way he puts it. But completion will turn out to be no longer being in the world. But that doesn't mean just dying at a certain point and knowing, hey, this is the moment I'm dying and I'm dead, I'm flatlined. Only the particular Dasein decides its existence, whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting. Okay, so the existential projects about existence and life and death and the meaning of life, and it sucks because we'll never get a good answer. We can only YOLO, you only live once, or at least this one time you're living right now is the only one you can live once. Maybe there are past lives and future lives, but so it's not existentialism. That's, this way of understanding this idea or this problem of existence. He'll call existentialism the two L's. And that's purely ontic. The question of existence is one of Dasein's ontical affairs. Occasionally, you might question your existence. Maybe this takes us in the realm of psychotherapy or psychology or, you know, traditional existentialism, and that's fine. But Dasein has other affairs too. What? Being the unique radical inquirer of being, the meaning of being, as built into it. The existentialist projects with the two L's there, it does not require an ontological structure of existence should be made theoretically transparent. He's going to try to get to something even beneath existentialism. So the French, some of them run off with various types of existentialism. I'm going to state it. That's not Heidegger. That they may be drawing or appropriating some aspect, but they're doing, to me, the ontical things. The question about the structure aims at the analysis outside under regular of what constitutes existence. This context of structures we call existentiality. Its analytic has the character of an understanding, which is not existential with two L's, but rather existential with one L. So the task of an existential analytic of Dasein has been delineated in advance. The existential analytic of Dasein is the ground or what's prior, the pre-comprehension, even of the questioner, because we don't want to say what it is. Therefore, I wouldn't say it's a human being or a human scientist or a human philosopher. It's just Dasein and everything else he just said about it has that relationship of being towards being, the meaning of being as a question. The meaning of the question is not transparent. It's not set out in advance. Plot me into a lab and say, hey, these are the rules by which you're going to go and discover X, Y, and Z and go do the work of science. No, it's something more fundamental. And he's taking it up. But he's not naive to say that I'm not going to deal with the ontical realm because what does he want to do? He wants to question classical metaphysics. That assumes that. But he's not doing it with a subject. That's what makes him and Derrida so strange. You guys are destroying metaphysics. You're not talking about relativism. You're questioning the whole project and what's been transmitted. And you don't seem to be starting with your own subject position and state that's the main question for metaphysics. Nor are you setting out to define what being is. Hey, being is this or that or that. And that it's not existentialism either. The circle gets more contorted, or at least let's call it the relationship. What's he doing here? It's like this. If it is a circle, sometimes it's going this way. Sometimes it reverses its direction, goes the other way, or maybe you want to say it's rectilinear. But the existence is the determining character of Dasein. And believe me, it's not present at hand now. It's not your birth certificate. It's not the chronology of your life or events. Don't use calendar chronological time. I'm tempted sometimes to think about native life. Not that I have access to native, indigenous spiritualities and temporalities, but I just wonder if I'd grown up, if we'd grown up in, like, would that be a different horizon of being in time and our relationship to them that doesn't use the clocks and calendars in this modern technical sense? Not to, minimize the complexity of native life with regard to modernity, but just spaces that don't calculate time in the way we do, living in a modern industrial structure. Um, the ontological analytic of this entity always requires that existentiality be considered beforehand. But see, by existentiality, we understand the state of being that is constitutive for those entities that exist. He'll come back to Aristotle and Aquinas, who, if those traditional metaphysical approaches is to go for the being that is constitutive for all entities that exist. Anything that is summons us to what constitutes them as an entity, as such. And is there something in us, and Heidegger's going to bring this up, he's going to tell you that Aristotle and Aquinas are not doing ontology. He has to destroy that. But they both invoke the soul as some unique attribute or feature that will give us the ability to access not entities as they are, but the being that constitutes them, what brings them together. That sounds about right, because that's what I wouldn't say that for Aristotle, but certainly for Aquinas. And then Kant will do something to that, by arguing that even the unity of the I in terms of the representations is itself grounded in his transcendental structures, in his projects, which he's trying to clarify. Time is very important because that's the schematism that allows us to keep all of our representations together so we can even get some understanding of anything. Why a plate that looks like a circle is not exactly the a priori ideality of the circle, but at least we have the experience of the plate. We'll intuit that. We'll never get the pure intuition of an ideal thing like a circle itself. It has to always come in the form of something that exists. So, but that's not That's not the project here. This is what are they about? Yeah. So state of being that is constituent of those entities that exist. But in the idea of such a constitutive state of being, that's all he's saying is that at least the presupposition or assumption of being is already included, not because entities exist and they're beings. And you can say, oh, well, if they're beings, then that presupposes they must have being. He's not saying that. He's just saying that at least this very idea of being is included in anything that exists. So you assume that, right? The possibility, therefore, of carrying out through an analytic of Dasein depends on working out the question beforehand about the meaning of being in general. Again, he comes back to this. You don't see fundamental ontology. You don't see a systematic philosopher here saying, hey, here's the question of being, and I'm going to try to answer it with this big treatise. It's substance, it's this, it's that, Spinoza, or the cogito, or the monad, or you just this. That's not what he's doing here. He's just saying, look, and it's not even as simple as saying, well, for me to raise the question about the meaning of being, I need to assume being exists. He's trying to get at the ground of what we mean by this thing, term existence. When you say entities exist, somehow being is included. And quite frankly, that's not the project. He's not going to go and describe a bunch of entities. Somebody else can do that. He's concerned about the inquiry into the question of meaning of being, which is this Dasein. Sciences are ways of being in which Dasein comports itself towards entities which it need not be itself. Sciences are ways of being. So Dasein's comporting itself to the sciences, but it's not itself the sciences, and he's not going to do a science of Dasein, although fundamental ontology sometimes is called the science of the meaning of being. But it's not science. Social science, so your social sciences, or science. It's not that. Dasein, being in a world, is something that belongs essentially. I love this. Being not only being in the world, but something that belongs. Can you imagine the maybe what he takes out of the pre-Socratics? Just this feeling of belonging. Being is a feeling of belonging, not just to the world that you're in. To be in the world means, at least you're, and you might say belong, I belong to this country or this family or this institution or this lineage, this race. No, not that belonging. Being in a world is something that belongs essentially. Dasein's understanding of being pertains with equal primordiality both to an understanding of something like a world and to the understanding of the being of those entities which become accessible within the world. Let's go down to footnote 3. Innerhalb der Welt. Heidegger uses at least 3 expressions which might be translated as in the world, innerhalb der Welt, in der Welt, adjective or adverb, innerweltlich. What are they? Within the world, in the world, and within hyphen the world. Sometimes you'll see later on within world. Being in the world is not just being an object in space, but being contained in something. I'm on Earth. We're on Earth. That's the and then within world, with a world, within world as the world, really, to be honest. Like just to belong and be within and be of is not the physical world for sure. And it's not the inner world of the imagination either. But it's that clearing and disclosure and what allows for something to be so you enter into it. And he, the good phenomenologist that he is, this early Heidegger, taking what he's taking from Husserl, is to understand that pre-comprehension of the world that you're in. And you might say, I want to describe that empirically. I want to theorize that. I want to totally explain the world that I'm in. That's not the project. That's science and social science. Okay. Um, how does he get to then this definition? So whatever an ontology takes for its themes, entities whose character of being is other than that of Dasein has its own foundation and motivation in Dasein's own ontical structure in which a pre-ontological understanding of being is comprised as a definite characteristic. So is he saying here, and I'm asking you, whenever an ontology takes for its theme entities whose character of being is other than Dasein, let's assume everybody else, religion, theology on God, and more than God. It's not just a metaphysical conception of God. It's the relationship to humans. Presumably, every world religion has to deal with the human being in their relationship to something. Abrahamic, you might want to call that God. Others, nirvana, transcendence. You know, right? That's their world. Okay, fine. Scientists, the physical, material world. All the sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, zoology, ecology, other than Dasein. But how can you say this? Well, if you're going to try to understand what they're doing, whatever ontology has its own foundation in Dasein's own ontological structure. And remember, Dasein's not a being or a thing, not like any other entities. It's distinguished, special, and that's ontological. But here he's saying, because he's not going to answer the question of meaning of being right away at the beginning, like a thesis, and then try to prove it, he's actually, this is it. The pre-ontological understanding of being is complex. What the heck is this pre-ontological understanding? What is this sedimentation of sense that we're going to get Derrida for the first human tradition, in which you can't have some commitment to it naively like an empiricist? Oh, here's the beginning. Or you say, no, 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 these are these. I love science and geometry. It's eternal truths, and the genius of our minds can come up with these forms that are, once we discover them, we already know they're there for eternity, and that's beautiful. Mathematics is so beautiful. Remember that? He's avoiding both empirical historicity and Platonic kind of transcendental forms to understand, because there's no origin. And yet there's something that's gripping us, the spiritual connection, that return forces of return. There's this back and forth going on to see how the heck the whole thing, how sense even comes into existence. But he's not going to tell some story like the creator and the created. It's this problem of historicity, a transcendental phenomenology of historicity. Okay, so pre-ontology, let's see. So what do we have now? And then this kind of wraps up. Um, Therefore, fundamental ontology question, which is supposed to answer the question of meaning of being, as the grounding thing for all everybody else to do whatever they're doing. I'm just saying religion and science for now, but you can think of other things, from which alone all other ontologies can take their rise. And Heidegger here, for his radicality, is not going to be doing worldviews, which is a big thing, diltai on the historical epochs that form the sciences, the later Husserl and his crisis about, which Derrida sees a lot more in, obviously, but still concerned with not spiritual significations, not subjectivities, but just whatever the phenomenological reduction is to the essential experience of anything. So this is something that is prior to all other ontologies, and yet you're not going to be answering right now this fundamental ontology's main question, because this prior thing called the analytic of Dasein, which is not existentialism of human beings in the world, but a true, it is ontological, but he says here it's pre-ontological, the last paragraph. It's the fundamental, if you will, pre-ontological structure that will put us in a position and try to secure that place to engage in the fundamental ontology that will then be the ground for all everything else that is. And that's what doesn't get finished here, is what everyone will tell us. And he never gets to fundamental ontology. It ends, we're left in suspense, and then it's abandoned. Okay, fine. Let the Heidegger scholars focus. But we're here, just like we're here. We're going to be going to be early Derrida. Okay, but what then brings us back away again from fundamental ontology and any temptation of metaphysics is that the modern issue of prioritizing finitude that begins with, let's say, later Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. I don't know. People can debate that. But we're not doing fundamental ontology. Here he goes. He comes back to these priorities in trying to define the uniqueness or the special nature of Dasein. Not the uniqueness or the special nature of either the human or God or the relation. First priority is ontological one. We're going to assume is an entity whose being has a general character of existence. He's going to have to assume this. It's an entity whose being has character of existence, but it's ontological. See, so a lot of people might tell Heidegger, "Hey, come on, this is a lot of confusion." First, you say it's ontically unique because it's ontological. Now you say it's ontological. Which one? It's both. It's neither. It's together. What are you talking about here? What the heck is Dasein? And Heidegger, to his part, might say that's not the question. I'm not going to tell you what the subject matter of Dasein is. Go talk to some scientists about their subject matter. Dasein is in itself ontological because existence is thus determinative for it. Existence is not just the stretch of birth to death and the values you might have, what kind of conscience you're going to have. It's not all the different craft or technique for Aristotle, intelligence, making good decisions, the Nicomachean ethics, not to simplify that because that's a big thing for Heidegger, obviously. But you know what the conclusion is there for Aristotle. It's the contemplative, the thinker is the one that shares in the divine existence because you're not contracting with others to determine your happiness. And as a just human being, you're not working for others. He's not saying you're being selfish, but it's like this purest kind of notion of what would be the surest path towards happiness, when there's no means towards another end other than what it is in itself. And that can only be this divine activity called contemplation. I'm butchering the Aristotle. I think it's more complicated than that. But keep that there. That's not the project here. Meaning trying to get to some transcendental definition of what the inquirer is. Dasein, because he's got this ontic priority, since Dasein is in itself ontological, because existence is determinative for it, equal primordiality, Dasein possesses as constitutive for its understanding of existence and understanding of the being of all entities of a character other than its own. So its own character linked up to the ontic problem of existence. Existence is not just existing in linear time, but the whole of our authentic sense of what will this have meant for us and what good choices we make that are truly speaking to the inner call we might have, seeing that we're always suffering and falling into everything else. We want to bring ourselves back. We want to make sure we're the ones doing the choosing. We're holding ourselves accountable, choosing to choose, as he says, to have a conscience, not because religion tells you got to have it, or your parents tell a kid, don't do that. You want to feel guilty, like not because you committed a crime, but because you want to put yourself on trial for to take your own existence into account. Don't let someone else do it. It's not a good or bad decisions in life. It's just like, geez, like I got to be responsible. That's great. That's kind of like a Nietzschean project. Don't just do what everyone tells you to think for yourself. Be yourself. Become yourself. But here, this assumption of existence and all the structures of it and the existentiality of it with the 1L is about the understanding of being that then grounds everything else. That you have to admit for the early Heidegger is what's at stake here. He is actually, like a philosopher might want to, of that ambition, ground everything we could possibly know about anything. That's what a young philosopher would do. The later one says, no, that's not what I'm up to. I don't care about that. But here it gets complicated. Dasein, therefore, third priority. Ontological condition. That is not clear. Derrida he's going to have fun with that. As you know, he's going to mess around with that. Erasure of that distinction, the trace of it, what remains from that. I mean, what is the hyphen point? He'll do everything with that because that's his strategy for the possibility of all ontologies. early Derrida, Origin of Geometry through Husserl, two different paths to this. Primordiality that gives rise. Dasein has turned out to be more than any other entity, that one which must be interrogated ontologically. So what he's basically saying is that you got the ontic component. Um, you're not going to answer it. It's not just one among many sciences. That's why it is fundamentally ontological, not metaphysical. That too could be considered a science, divine science, to quote Aristotle. There's a divine being. It should have a divine science about itself. We're opening up the metaphysics. Not that, but not just human existence. This last paragraph I'll read, and we'll just quickly summarize because all I want to do is just a couple of paragraphs and a couple of lines really in Derrida that will get our discussion going. Love to see what you think about that. But this paragraph, the roots of the existential analytic on its part are ultimately existential. So here he goes. It's like back to this circle. I thought you're going to tell us we're not doing existentialism and the ontic is not the priority here. Because now you're talking about the roots of this. Well, that's the Heidegger approach. That's what most Heideggerians have to agree on is that we're not talking about angels and on a pinhead or some fantasy unicorn. We're talking about being in the world. So, and nothing in the history of metaphysics has really gotten us to this point where we can actually then question this idea of being in the world. Theology might do it, religion can do it in their own ways, but they want you to have some faith in something, not question for yourselves what the ultimate ground is, and for you to come up with that concept. They can give you some maxims and ideas, and you can have faith. The roots are ontical only if the inquiry of philosophical research itself seized upon in an existential manner as a possibility of the being of each existing Dasein does it become at all possible to disclose the existentiality of existence and to undertake an adequately founded ontological problematic. What? This ontical priority of the question of being has also become plain. Well, not really. There's a lot of contortions going on here, a lot of back and forth. Roots of the analytic ontical, ontical priority of the question, but founded if if you can seize the existential manner of the possibility of the being of each existing Dasein, because possible close the existentiality of existence to do this problematic ontologically, not ontically. I don't want to take the time to disentangle it. A good deconstructionist can play around with this and just, yeah. Heidegger's turning himself into a pretzel. We don't need to do it. And it's not, someone might want to disentangle it and justify the project. Let them do that. But let's just say here, Heidegger again is saying, so for no misunderstanding, I can tell you the precedents are there, seen quite early, but this Dasein, so this ontological hyphen thing, relation, difference, horizon, it was seen, but those old guys did not grasp not only the existential question wasn't seized upon, but it's not a genuine ontological structure. What were they doing? The a suke ta tos esteem, suke soul being, uh, that's my rudimentary translation, but his man's soul is suke are all the things that are. Try to translate it for myself, but man's soul is in a certain way entities. The soul which makes up the being of man has asthenesis, and noesis, knowing, among its ways of being, and in these it discovers all entities. So that's the priority, the kind of ontotheological, anthropocentric, rootedness in this entity called man. The human has a capacity, this thing called a soul. The rock doesn't have a soul, and what's great about it, you can analyze that thing to see how it works. Kant tries to do that. And at least you can ground what you think you know about things. At least you care to know about things. That's all good. Good for the human being. Um, Aristotle's principle, which points back to the ontological thesis of Parmenides, is one which Thomas Aquinas has taken up. Thomas is engaged in the task of deriving the transcendentia, those characters of being which lie beyond every possible way in which an entity may be classified, is coming under some generic kind of subject matter. Like classifying, putting things under categories, understanding, knowing. The categories themselves can be transcendental, but if you're going to know anything about anything, like truly what they are in their essence, and once we know what the ultimate ground of everything is going to be, not just God, but the being of God, is what gives to everything else that can exist as it is, not just because as an element of the creation and all due allegiance to the creator, but that's his metaphysical. It's a little bit more complicated. The very being of God has some special relationship to the being of all that exists, the Christian God. Thomas has to demonstrate that the verum is as such a transcendence, truth. He does this by invoking an entity which, in accordance with its very manner of being, is properly suited to come together with entities of any sort whatsoever. This distinctive entity, and quo natum, as convenere cum omni ente, is the soul. Hence the priority of Dasein over all other entities emerge, although it has not been classified. So he's giving himself some anchors. He's saying, I'm going after something unique as a priority that's given to it to understand. So in a way, it's very kind of traditional. But he's got this radically modern way of talking about it, namely Dasein, but also within this ontological, ontic complexity that he's struggling to define here. So what does he say in the end? I'm just going to read this last paragraph because I really want to introduce the Derrida. Do a quick summary of this and set up the Derrida. If to interpret the meaning of being becomes our task, Dasein is not only the primary entity to be interrogated, it is also that entity which already comports itself in its being towards what we're asking about when we ask this question. Let's look at that. Meaning of being, our task. Dasein has it's a being as the inquirer. We got to inquire into that. That's the analytic. The ontic priority is existence. Just got to assume that it at least exists without knowing what that means. It's got to be interrogated. It's an entity which comports itself, remember that towards being is relationship of being. We're asking about that, if you will, relationship of being, which will turn out to be something transcendental all time. But in that case, the question of being is nothing other than the radicalization of an essential tendency of being, which belongs to Dasein itself, the pre-ontological understanding of being. Okay, so if you look at the table of contexts, time is a horizon for understanding of being. There is no answer to the fundamental question of the meaning of being in this book. You have this existential analytic of Dasein. A lot of parts to this Dasein, being in the world and care and death. But you're going to learn quickly here that the meaning of Dasein's being is going to be temporality. There's something primordial and ecstatic. That is it that feeling of exploration? Is it the feeling of aging? Is it that constant vertigo of like looking at time and sometimes you feel like, oh wow, I have a lot of time. This is Aristotle's physics, book 4. Sometimes you're bored. Yesterday I went downstairs because I thought the laundry was done. It still had 2 minutes to go. I didn't want to come back upstairs and go back down. So I waited for it, and that 2 freaking minutes took forever. Meanwhile, I come back to my office and I got to finish an email before I start this other meeting. I'm not done typing. I want to hit the send. I don't want to make any grammatic mistakes. They're both the same 2 minutes. So that's the later here. I mean, eventually what Heidegger gets into, and then the books afterwards, being time to try to unpack some of the uncanniness of those. But abandoning phenomenology as a process, and the way Husserl tried to look at the connection of the present as retentions and protension and kind of complex flux, as if you can spatialize such a thing. with Heidegger, eventually, you're not going to be able to say anything about that enigma because it's not, you're going to prioritize what's present at hand. You can't start with that. But here, this massive, not circle, time is right understanding of being does and its meaning of being in a relation. None of that's being said here, but you do have this radicalization and pre-ontological. And I think that could be the shift to Derrida because I'm only going to really look at the last paragraph of Derrida. Okay. Is this the Derrida? Kind of looks like it, right? We can end this here pretty quickly. We can have a good hour for discussion. Yeah, this is the Derrida. Unfortunately, we can't get through all of this chapter 3, but I do want to introduce here. So the prior sections are, again, just to kind of recapitulate everything. You're not going back to some simple empirical origin in history, because history itself is being reduced phenomenologically. You want to assume there's at least a culture of sense and sensibility that's going to be there beforehand, but not in a way that we can readily access because it's sedimented. And from that, there is a back and forth in terms of this transmission that took place to at least position that first geometer or the first ones to then be in the position to do what they're going to do. Forget about the excellence of what happened. Oh, yeah, they came up with the theorem. And oh, yeah, then everything began. That's not what these guys are talking about. But more than that, they're talking about why is it binding for us? How come we are caught up in either the naive belief that this is just the way it is, or is there something even buried further that's beckoning us to question that? So it's not just questioning the veracity of the geometric truth, but it's more like he's getting at this question of it's not enough to just talk about the culture that was there. It's not, we're definitely not going to talk about subjectivities. Like, oh, let's just retrace what that first geometer had to go through to come up with that first theorem. You're not going to do that. That's all buried. But there is this commitment to at least truth. I'm going to read from here, and this will get us into some really strange things that we can contrast. And I guess the question on the table is if Heidegger is trying to talk about pre-ontology, is Derrida doing that too, but he's linking it to this problem of historicity and the transmission of truth? Culture and tradition of truth, like that was built. It's not just what the critics of Derrida say. Oh, this guy hates truth and he just wants to, there is no truth and he wants to deconstruct, the various philosophical attempts to talk about truth or language is stable and art having any kind of meaning. And he's just a relativist or skeptic guy. And, he's, he's polluting all the young minds and, he's a bad guy. No, it's a much deeper question than that. The question is like, how did this culture tradition of truth is characterized by paradoxical historicity? What is that? That doesn't mean it relativizes the truth or says the truth has an origin. It's almost a Nietzschean problem about the truth. You want to know how this even came about. In one sense, they can appear disengaged from all history since they are not intrinsically affected by the empirical content of real history and by determined cultural interconnections. So you can put these mathematical truths, for example, above anything as timeless. If you situate them empirically inside history and say, well, human beings came up with them and we're going to be willing to admit that, but once they come to existence, they're eternal. Or they were already there, we just had to discover them. This emancipation can be confused with the breaking from history in general. For those who confine themselves to historical factuality, as well for those who enclose themselves in the ideality of validity, the narration of truth can only have the historic originality of the myth. In a way, he's kind of getting at this, the positioning of truth to us as either above history. That seems like an obvious myth. But is he also talking about the mythification of discovering, like historians want to do, the history of math and science, for example, or the history of philosophy, of the necessity behind why it began, and therefore how does that accrue to its validity? What about this? In another sense, one that corresponds to Husserl. This is his claim, what Husserl was intending. The tradition of truth is the most profound and purest history. That's amazing. Tradition of truth, like that's the tradition we're in. And you might say, hey, this is just the West. I'm not going to speak for the Northwest or pre-colonial, before colonial contact to the West with the global South and the East, but other traditions can have another way of characterizing this. He's presumably here speaking about the West. Only the pure unity of such a tradition sense is apt to establish this continuity. Indeed, without this, no authentic history would be thought or projected as such. There would only be an empirical aggregate of finite and accidental units. So there wouldn't be any necessity for sure. But his idea of authentic history, as soon as phenomenology breaks from both conventional Platonism and historicist empiricism, here we go, the movement of truth that it wishes to describe is really that of a concrete, specific history, the foundations of which are temporal creative subjectivities, acts based on the sensible world and the life world as cultural world. So, I wish I had time to. Earlier in the section, he talks about, in his own way. Okay, if you can just indulge me, if I can just take us through a couple more paragraphs. He's going to get us to this problem of time and a grounding of all sciences, but not time like we think it. It's not the naive position of the historicist sitting here, 2026, and I'm going to go to the 5th century BC or 4th century BC and describe the conditions by which Euclid arose, and he was, and then, not to simplify the historicist project, but to say the conditions here give the breakthrough its due, the genius of the individual, for example, the romanticization of the genius, that he transcended the time, and then the truth of that geometric work came out. And then we can all admire it now because it's indisputable because we follow the logic of it. Just like if you speak a certain language that you grew up in, you don't have to doubt its meaning. You can at least use it to navigate the world. But I'm not going to go up to Paul, for example, so we both speak English, and say, Paul, I don't understand your English. For the most part, I do. Now, we can interpret each other's and get into debates about the meaning of language and then disagree. But at least we're both living in that same language. We're not talking about the historicist idea of the origins of the geometric proposition. And we, for the most part, are not mathematicians who can live and dwell in that world by which that becomes operable. Or to use Heidegger's language, the subject matter, when someone says, this is my subject matter, you just start talking about that whole world. That opens up the world that opens up. But here, let's see what he says. We're not ego-logical. We're not going to go back to the ego. It's not psychological memory, but there is something about this distinction. Husserl already distinguishes between psychological temporality as successiveness, what Hume described. By the way, Kant did too, in the Skepticism. And the temporality of the synthetic interconnections of sense, something that Kant couldn't do in the Skepticism. He continued to explicate this difference, and in The Origin, he emphasizes that the scientific stage is not only a sense which in fact comes later, but the integration of the whole earlier sense in a new project. It's not only a sense which in fact comes later. Okay, now we want to say, hey, there's some primitive minds back then, and just with progress, and you get the real guys that come along, Galileo, Newton. Then we set the stage for the foundations, and that's how we continue to move forward towards that commitment to the truth and understanding of everything. We're going to radically question that. The integration of the whole earlier sense in a new project. Is this a philosophy of science and scientific activity, discontinuity, rupture, paradigm collapse? No, let's just leave that alone. This is the real question here, is this problem of what will turn out to be time also. And then I will conclude with this last paragraph, these two paragraphs here. Etiological subjectivity cannot be responsible for this development which is continually totalized in an absolute present. Only a communal subjectivity can produce the historical system of truths and be wholly responsible for it. He doesn't say language at this point. Eventually, he'll get into language. Excuse me. He says communal subjectivity. This total subjectivity whose unity must be absolute and a priori, otherwise even the slightest truth would be unimaginable, is but commonplace of all ecological subjectivities, whether actually present or possible, whether past, present, or future, whether known or unknown. Like if you dive into some branches of mathematics today, they'll say, hey, some theorems were created, but we never came up with the proof. We're all working on them. We're part of this community that's trying to set out. Someone's going to do it. Maybe someone discovers a new theorem, although that seems to be kind of rare. The big heyday was from the 17, 18, I guess 1900s. But that's you're already entering into that world of the communal subjectivity to do the work. How dare you, though, ask about the pre-ontology, if you will, the sedimentations of sense as a real issue that you want to reduce that allowed for that bizarre leap without passing through the egological subjectivity. The geometric truth appears, you can see it, it's written down, but I want to know about the arche, and then maybe the Derrida's critique of Foucault is like, we're on this side of reason, whatever we think is, and the institutionalization of madness, but you, Foucault, and we're sitting in this epoch, discontinuous, there's a rupture, there's no way to cross over of another world where this world didn't exist. Therefore, what's the relationship between reason and non-reason, or reason using the language of reason and its relationship to madness? Because here it's about power and control, institutionalization and confession, constantly manufacturing the problem and torturing the crap out of the clinically instituted with this apparatus of power. That's what you're saying, Foucault, but there's the gap. Can't use this language to either describe the gap, let alone really truly get into this space. And Derrida, for his part, is saying this whole setup is itself this machinition of both language and its relationship to reason, for which this project couldn't even arise. So it doesn't matter, it's a schematic. Not to mention that you're presupposing what's on the other side of the gap that you say we can't cross over and describe. He's doing a lot of things in his critique, like a devastating critique of that beginning of Foucault. Similar thing here, though, is this origin is not present as a past moment in time. Okay, I want to this is where we'll conclude, I promise. We have some questions here. The irreducible historicity of geometrical becoming is characterized by the fact that the total sense of geometry and its necessary noetic correlate total subjectivity could not have been present as a project and then as a mobile fulfillment at the beginning. If the history of geometry were only the development of a purpose, wholly present from the beginning, we would have to deal only with an explication or quasi-creation. Neither pure diachrony, change over time, nor stasis, systemic reproduction in an equilibrium that doesn't change over time, make history. What the heck is historicity? What is this term? And I'll stop sharing here just to conclude. Historicity is not the historical present. It's not empirical history. Maybe it's another name for finitude, but the project is so radical here that the audacity to say, you've been handed over something, this entire tradition, and you might want to say with the ancient Greeks, at least the logocentric commitment to math, which would then become the foundation of modern science as a tradition that carries. And then, this other little field, philosophy, the history of philosophy and metaphysics in the West, pursuing the truth, maintaining the commitment to the transmission, being part of that total communal subjectivity. This, but the origin, if you think there's an origin to that, it's not only are you being naive, you can go down the religious path and say, oh, the creator in the beginning was the word. I mean, yeah, for Christianity, the beginning was the word. But for the Hebraic, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and the world was without form. He said, let there be light. You want to spatialize ecstatically this stretched relationship that we are for ourselves because you want to believe in that past point that existed. And then you tell yourself the story. But to question that or to reduce that phenomenologically and get to some kind of pre-ontological sense building that made this possible, it's ambitious. It's the paradox of asking about the origin of the Judeo-Christian God, huh? In a transcendental manner. Not the texts were born and this is the history and this is what happened. And oh, by the way, there's the historical Jesus, at least for Christianity. And the Gospels came later, and Gospel writers didn't see the guy, neither did Paul, but Paul's the real foundation. He got the real wisdom because actually the Spirit, Jesus, the Trinity didn't appear to him, and he's just the attester to that. Now, you're asking about if you're gonna the fascinating thing here is we're talking about something other to an origin, later registers of Derrida, non-origin of the origin. The problem of temporality itself, because if you get down and start to plot ideas of origin and end, and how can something have a beginning and an end, you get into all the corporeas of metaphysics. That's not primordial temporality. The Husserl has this absolute living present, which is doing all kinds of things. Derrida is going to deconstruct that too. We'll see that later. But at least we can take away questions of historicity, this movement of transmission, this problem of responsibility, this impossibility of an origin, the aporia not that's surrounded by that. This will allow him to do all kinds of stuff about speech and writing, which will take off in the 60s. Um, and it's too soon to talk about the trace as something beyond absence of presence, but remains. So, okay, that's the legacy of the West. How does this connect to the Heidegger piece? Well, it's really mushy. It's this, I don't know, how do we feel about the ontological ontic? Heidegger he says, I'm not trapped in a circle. But all he seems to be doing in that section is creating more complexity and more mute. How do you put this? It's like a metamorphosis of the circle. It's a monstrous like mutation of contradictions and perhaps even fallacies, which is why analytics can try to go after him. If you bring up the passage there, what are his terms? Ontic ontological, pre-ontological, Daseinsformant towards being, relationship of being, the transcendental variant or the truth is not science as a system of propositions. No, let's go back to the metaphysicians. Aristotle, Aquinas. Something hangs together in that entity of which we have access to in terms of its being, because somehow we have a relationship to it. Aquinas, Christian God, divine science, Aristotle. It has to know itself. If it's going to be divine, it's going to have a knowledge of itself. We're lucky to have occasionally a moment of that happiness when we can contemplate. That's him. Aquinas has his grounding for the Christian God through metaphysics. Heidegger was saying these guys don't know how to do ontology. They're not even raising it. But at least we're talking about a transmission. So he can justify what he's talking about, which is existence. So, okay, I will stop here because the way we want to maybe get into it, maybe this session today is you can't really connect the two texts. It just seems like there's a juxtaposition, but There's no clear way to bring them together. That's fine. We can maybe just try to interpret each for themselves. Does anyone want to share what they encountered in either text that struck them? Yes, that.
Yeah, hi. I thought I had to leave. I came back.
Oh, good.
The one way I thought of the one thing I thought that connected the two texts was like the idea of like science as a type of culture. I mean, when Heidegger talks about it, it's more of like the linking together of truths. But I think if we think about that kind of in the way Derrida, at least to me, seems to be laying that out, is that that creation of truth is part of our kind of cultural world. I don't know. That was the way I was relating the two, was just through this idea of culture. And I mean, I think for Heidegger, there's a whole kind of theological aspect underlying being
Hmm.
time that has that its own cultural dimension. Um,
You see this theological?
yeah, I mean it's hard to read about Dasein without thinking about a soul, right? I mean, but it did really kind of strike me what you said, because when you read like Wikipedia and shit like that, it's like it's all the definitions of Dasein like on the internet, they all related to human being, right? But I don't know, you really like open my eyes, so that's not necessarily what he's talking about.
He didn't say the human, and Derrida talks about the transcendental we here, communal ego, not the ego or the I, the monadological I. There's no human in Dasein so far, at least explicitly. But he says we, and same here. There's definitely, I don't, do you see a human being? Who's the subject here, Derrida? There is no subject.
Yeah. Um,
And then
but
is this like an injunction? Like if someone says, don't ask what Dasein is, because that's like subject predicate. That's back in the realm of social science and science. What is this and what is the cause of this?
I mean, to try and think about it though, from the scientific like standpoint, and there's a whole ton of stuff that gets left out in the social sciences, right? About the kind of like what's the biological foundation for sociality in the first place, right? We don't ever kind of get into talking about that. But I mean, this kind of has me thinking about being itself as like a realm of experience that, like, yes, we know humans are privy to, but that doesn't mean we're the only ontical being for that has the access to that, right? It just means we know it about ourselves. There could be other beings that have access to other, um, modes of being, right? But I'm confusing myself because I don't think we're really talking about that either.
It's really uncanny when Heidegger says science is just one of those affair modes of being that Dasein can have. But so is its existence, meaning like traditional existentialism. Hey, I feel unfulfilled and, I hate living in America and can't relate to anything anymore because it's just so maddening and it disgusts me, literally being equated with being, in a way, by being a citizen of the country that remains here, complicit with it. Right? So that's the nausea stuff. Not even call it stuff, but yeah, that's not the grounding of this question of the meaning of being. If you have that universalist kind of ideal, which later generations will deconstruct, they'll say that project's impossible, including the later Heidegger. But he then brings it back to this ontical priority, as he says, and Paul's asking about ontological ontic. I wish I had the answer to that. Ontology for sure existed prior. If you might say that ontology is the question of being, and there are various ways it's being has been put through the history of philosophy and metaphysics in the West, and there are various attempts to answer it. That's not the question of the meaning or sense of being. So that's a phenomenological problem, the rising of sense. And that's all out of Husserl logical investigation, sense and nonsense. Um, even time itself not as a linear structure, not just the essence of the experience that we have of it, or that kind of strangeness I mentioned when it slows down or speeds up. if we bring it back to something human, but just the basic aporias that Aristotle came up with. Present is moving, if the present is moving itself and becoming past, making room for a future to arrive and become present, or present's moving into a future, and like a dead snake shedding its skin, leaving something that will become past. And then Aristotle himself, credit to him, says, wait a minute, the way of thinking about this is going to lead to all kinds of confusions. He himself innocently says, oh, this is hard. I don't know if we're going to get a sense to it. And Derrida will pick up on this to then go after Heidegger to say, look, to even think you're grounding something like temporality as presence. You don't say it's present at hand or ready to hand or present now, but you think you can disclose it. And I'm going to take us back into this concealment, which is, you're not going to disclose anything. But I think, do both projects have this in common that is this the Nietzsche in them that you're going to question this world of truth? Western Dasein has this world of truth. And if you don't have that anymore, you still have the will to something like nothingness, which is nihilism. You want to ask about the truth of the will later. Heidegger gets into this, but is this ontotheology? Is it the constitution of being and the constitution of truth find a primordial origin in the West, usually through the ancient Greeks, and then we have to just assume that they have a relationship, but both projects take us back to this. Derrida used the word historicity because he's taking it beyond and it was seen that Heidegger's taking it back to individual finitude because he's going to bring it back to depth and resolve and anxiety and conscience and that feeling of running out of time and not being able to do everything and yet not, or flattening out. I'm not going to think about death. I'm just going to live forever and just, swim in my present and have fun. Or no, I'm going to be this morose, morbid person that's constantly worried if I'm going to die if I cross the street. That's not the relationship. That's not existential death. That's dying, fear of dying. Those are profound psychological. I don't want to make light of them. But it has to do with the finitude of temporality. That's the problem. And Western Dasein has never been able to get a grip on it. They've either spatialized it or they made it empirical. That's the Derrida part. The Heidegger part, which we're going to get to, is that no, he's going to actually drive the linear flow of time, which began with Aristotle, takes us in this torturous path all the way up to Bergson, but accuses both guys of Plato's time as moving image of eternity. And the ultimate guy he tries to go after and fails on, if you ask me, is Hegel on spirit and time, is derived from this massively complicated primordial ecstatic temporality. That's a temporalizing process. And that to him is what clears or lights or discloses anything that can be. Not because we're beings in time or we're measuring things like space-time and time, but it's phenomenal. It's like the being of time itself is what clears and allows us to exist. His God could end up, if he has a God, could be a bizarre idea of time that's so bizarre to the Western mind. Because either they have a counter chronological time or they have the kairos, at least for the Christian God, the fulfilled time, or time, death, and resurrection. Paul, you wrote something in the chat. Do you want to share or do you want to just read it to the group? What would you like to do?
My voice is a bit bad today.
Oh, okay, I'll read it for you. Yeah, you save your voice because you may need it. Where does the ontological difference come from? If you want to separate ontology as the question of being, traditionally, Heidegger's fundamental ontology adds a nuanced question of meaning of being. You're not going to be able to get into this unless you go to that question. I'm going to hypothesize an entity that is this question because its being is an issue for it. It has a relationship to the very thing it's seeking. We're not going to simply add the history of metaphysics as answers because we don't care. That's a radical approach, radical destruction and transcendence, ambition. But as we'll see, it's going to have to come back to, he will pin it down to a couple of things eventually, care and temporality, care, death, temporality. That'll come. But here, so already for Heidegger, ontology is not what is being to be answered, independent of this Dasein analytic. But then he has this he's saying it's an he's that last section. It's ontically unique in that it's ontological. What? It exists, but it's existentialism like we human beings with all the terrible things we feel about existing. Not terrible as in, like we're judging it, but the hardship of existence, living, living and dying, being born, being in the world. So no, it's not that. That's two L's. The existential has this, and yet it's linked to the grounding and the pre-ontology that allows anybody else to inquire into anything that is. Oh, here's a precedent in the history of metaphysics, because we're going to call that the soul that gives us that linkage. Or is it as something as kind of cavalier, as I mentioned, maybe a little disrespectful or condescending, the creator God of the Bible, nothing, I don't know, the creator is transcendent above that, and then everything exists, and Big Bang cosmology, linear time, have an origin, everything starts. What's prior to that that allows the sense for that to even appear? It had to appear in history. Both those things, religion and science, had to appear in history for Derrida. But for the questioner, it's given to us maybe in a kind of fateful or destined way, ascending in some kind. It's a postcard, whether that we just get. But the person who sent it forgot to sign it, if you want to use that as a metaphor. But it's an erasure of that empirical notion to get to a deeper primordiality that has something to say about who we are. Did Heidegger come up with this? I'll get back to you on that. I don't want to misstate it. Dasein is an everyday word in German. Maybe untranslated is the sense I agree. This is not. I mean, they say being there. Yeah. Bios and Zoe. True. Bios for biology, Zoe for zoology. Psyche for psychology, Suke for soul. But bios and Zoe too. Life. Or think about Kairos and how many registers there are for that versus Chronos. Fulfill time versus Derrida right now. Yeah. Let me pause on the Saussure and the signifier, signified sign, and the differentiation of signs and the arbitrary nature of the relationship. I mean, what does he say about ontology when ultimately, just when you arrive at that ultimate signified, attached to some signifier, that thing is concealing a system of traces. Meaning it's like the deferral of an arrival at to that point of that signified has to close off this movement that's occurring that both defers and differentiates other signifiers from each other to create that sense of that signified. In other words, it's just like you're congealing something that is not true because it's concealing, in fact, the movement of these other signifiers. But let me, I want to pause on that. I mean, you asked a lot of quite great points here. I'll open that up to others, but the Dasein, I don't even think the new translation, by the way, just came out. Cyril Welch, Yale University Press, just arrived. Do what you will. McQuarrie Robinson's what we worked with. Stammer in the 90s. People didn't like that. Based on 3 decades of teaching, very commonsensical, doesn't get into even some of the German justifications for the German translations. But he doesn't use the word Dasein. He just says being there. Very commonsensical approach to how to get there. I don't like Dasein or being there because it's spatial. It connotes spatiality. But see, that's what the Heideggerian crowd wants because they spend most of their world in Division One, being in the world. And so do most philosophers. I mean, but that's not Plato and Aristotle and Hegel. Take at least take those four. It's not a question of just being in the world for those four, for sure. Yassine. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. In reading Heidegger's section 4,
Yeah, let's pick it
um,
up.
where he develops on understanding Dasein. He mentioned, well, we have three priorities. The first one was the ontic, the second, the ontological, but I have a hard time in understanding the third that you mentioned. So I first try to listen a bit, and I don't really get what he means by ontic, ontological, then with the dash in between. So is there any way that you could develop a little bit further on that?
Yeah, I always feel like the Derrida in us wants to just jump on the text and start deconstructing. And I mean that's the tendency. Because the other option is to presume there's some fixed meaning here, and I can get back to Heidegger's intention, let alone the translation, like get into the German. But let's just try to situate that within what came before, what's in this section, and then what exists for the whole text. In a way, Heidegger is telling us that he's not just going to start as a propositional structure. This is not deduction or induction. I have one principle and then I'm going to derive everything else from it. Or scientifically, I got to empirically, through induction, gather everything as possible. I might have an hypothesis, but start to observe and gather as much as possible. And then I might be able to describe how something works or is. And then it has some veracity. And oh, wow, I've contributed to a larger sense of understanding about something. So he's not doing either one of those. Fundamental ontology is not going to be, it is going to be the ground for everything else. That's the ambition. Good. So it gives Heidegger his fame. At least not that he's striving for fame, but the point is that, okay, I'm going to be able to explain everything. Someone goes around saying that. But why this priority of the existential analytic? The ontic one, because remember the definition of Dasein, first definition was inquired in the question of meaning of being. We're talking about inhabiting the question, not answering it. We want to raise the question of the meaning of the question. It sounds Derridean, but, because remember everyone else either posed it from the ancients up to now, the neo-Kantians of his time. It's universal. It has to exist for everything. It's necessary. That's the philosophical argument, maybe about substance. But it's empty. It's subject. It's what binds the subject and the predicate. It's also the root of language as a verb to allow us to say that anything is. Remember those sections early on? Okay, but we're not going to even define the space of fundamental ontology yet. What he then ends up doing is going back to who even cares about this? Why should one even care about the question of the meaning of being? Well, this is like the 5-year-old move. Let's see, who's going to care about the question of the meaning of being? Maybe there's a being who cares about its own being, the question of its own, the meaning of its own being. That's the little slippage there. Not the general. He wants the general. Okay, here's the history of metaphysics, 2,500 years old in the West. And then here's the answer. Now, there's a being that has a special and unique radical individuation with regard to that question. Its being is an issue for it, so its being is like an open question. That's the Nietzschean move. I'm not going to just receive all dogmatics. That's the Kantian move, actually. Just receive. I have to have that innate freedom and create my own law that I will to be universal. Start from myself. That's the facticity. So maybe it gets us this ontic existence. But the but the question of the meaning of being is going to turn for Dasein is going to not turn out to be all these other things. Once you go through everything from care to depth, you're going to land on temporality. And the guy that's the roadblock for him, who needs to lump back into everything else, is Hegel, and that's how the book ends. Spirit is the temporalizing of temporality. Geist, Hegel's main character, becomes Heidegger's answer about temporality, not the Hegel's answer to his question about spirit. It's like, again, the Agnew appropriation and taking it as one's own, taking oneself into account. So you know what the ontological is? He's not going to do it here. Pre-ontological is the clearing. with in other words, lighting that allows other people to show up as ontologies, to do whatever they're doing about beings, to describe them, religious or scientific. Existence here is the ontic first priority. We know that. If you just mean existere or existence, as in it also to be ecstatic, to stand out, to be outside of oneself and stand out, in the world, it's not just as a bounded object or apart from everything else and saying it exists. Particle and wave indiscernibility. Think about physics. It's more of this standing out in and as and with world. Other people will talk about that, but so you can think about that broadly speaking. Go down the theological route, the Gospels, Jesus was in the world, that's what the Gospel writers say, in the world but not of it, full of truth and grace, a being that was in the world, no longer in the world. He himself says that before he goes on trial. No longer in the world, I'm out. Take care of the disciples. You set me to love them. I did. Let them abide in our love for each other as they go out. But he's already saying he's no longer in the world. He's not dead yet. So, I mean, that theological register is important, is what I'm trying to say. It's because it gives you that sense of being in the world. It's not just being an existent in the world. That's the baggage of the Christian heritage in the West. And Heidegger's he's going to try to do something different from that. So the second priority, ontological, again, if you think ontology is not just a question, what is being and answering it, but what is the meaning of the question of the meaning of being? The meaning of the question of the meaning of being, because it's an issue for you. There's nothing more radical than that. It's like the paquet or suspension in phenomenology. There's nothing more radical than what these early Derridas up to. And trying to say historicity has a type of temporality or movement that goes beyond the origin that gives birth to the truth that remains, and then takes on that Platonic ideal of it was already there, it just had to be discovered, or it's a reduction just to the immanence of history itself, as some kind of empirical thing we can describe. Oh yeah, he doesn't care about either one. Remember, he called both naive. He's up to something else. That's deep. I'll just finish this piece here about this second part. So ontological here is more than just question of being. Then this third piece here is this equal primordiality, is this possession, the constitutive state, which he gets from Aristotle and Aquinas, as if you're going to inquire into the being or essence of anything, the real metaphysician doesn't care about the actual thing, the entity. But if you're going to get into its essence, you're going to assume that at least what exists is its constitution or state of being. But again, that's not empirical. It's not in the world as an object, present and radiant, he's Heidegger stuff. But what's primordial with it as its state or constitution, as something that exists, is its being. And if we're going to describe that part as opposed to the thing itself, back to Kant, we're back to this transcendental project. So I guess, if you will, this ontic and ontological connection, the linchpin here is this understanding of being, of all the entities out there other than its own. But this whole book turns out to be trying to get at Dasein's being. First care, death as its greatest possibility to be, which is possibility and impossibility, no longer being in the world. Using it as this analogy, Jesus is in the garden. He hasn't died. He hasn't been resurrected by himself in a sealed tomb that no one saw. Came out, saw his buddies, ascended, waiting the second coming. That's Christianity. If you don't have that, as Paul says, you got nothing. There's no faith. Bracket his finitude and his temporality heading towards death. That's more interesting. Because here's a guy talking about no longer being in the world, proleptically kind of announcing something there in this radical finitude. That's not just like dying like anybody else, because of course he's a unique one, dying to get rid of death and sin. We don't hear about that, but we hear about love. We hear about something that's so compelling. But point is that existence is not just existence in the world. It's about this constitutive state of being in that question. That's maybe a way to get into this ontological condition as a possibility. This is the hard part. Why does that become a possibility for all other ontologies? I guess one simple answer is that if you're going to be a theologian or a scientist, you're not going to sit there and take the time to develop a full-blown ontology about how you exist as such. You just engage in that enterprise, if that makes sense. But if you want to question how that's even possible, to be in a position to question anything that exists, then you have to raise the stakes about the ontological nature of that question. And the only concrete way of doing that is to admit it exists. If you're talking about something that exists, then you're back to the ontic. Kind of that's why it kind of goes up and down. I don't want to say it's a circle, but like up and down and it's like a ladder. Does that make sense, Yossi? It's an attempt to get us away from the circle. Because otherwise, ontic and
Yeah,
ontological just keep going around.
that's very helpful. So is there a kind of a parallel between what he describes as ontological, and the pre-ontological?
I don't see, I mean, if someone else can give us the definitions, pre-ontological, the terms will come into, later themes will come out. Mood, like Befindlichkeit, attunement, uncanniness of like just the happening that occurs. And, it's got to be pre-ontological. Like there are two versions of me in that example I gave. The one sitting in my laundry room waiting for my clothes to finish, two of the longest minutes of my life because I didn't want to leave it. And I didn't have my phone with me to at least read something or do something. I'm just standing there looking at it. Like, and I couldn't believe that it took forever. And then just literally after that was done, running upstairs to finish an email with also 2 minutes to go and didn't have enough time to finish it. And so the pre-ontological could be the anxiety. That's not me in both of those moments, but now stepping away and outside, that's the ontological, to have that ambition to try to describe the difference between the two experiences from the same subject with regard to this problem of time. I'm just giving that as an example because it just happened. It was real. I didn't make up that anxiety. I didn't like it. Now, maybe if I was more Buddhistic, I should try that. Is I could have flipped things on the head and just not felt anxious about the email and maybe felt and said, oh, time is just occurring for me in this moment and it's passing in a way that's where everything will be okay. I'm not saying that's Buddhism, but or I could have really not felt the pain of waiting for the laundry. I could have been in some other state where I might have been experienced and passed differently. And then the confluence of the temporalization of my existence at that moment could have been something else too. I don't know what it could be because if you're in that situation, you know how terrible it is. Or my example is ridiculous. And I think a very painful thing that a lot of us are fighting against, or some of us. But the more we understand the nature of solitary confinement for Western prisons or any prison, those of us that are in the abolishing prisons kind of paradigm that we're trying to imagine, something beyond, like Foucault would say, the current system. That there has to be another way to think about this or get into it. Come on.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering, Heidegger talks about this particularity of Dasein, on page 33, I think it's
Yeah,
second paragraph.
sure.
So, yeah, I think it's also concerns with what Dasein actually is, the question Paul was asking in the chat. Uh, I've always struck this problem with this problem. Now, yeah, you can say that Dasein exceeds, it transcends the boundaries, spatio-temporal boundaries, and it becomes universal. I think you're getting what I'm talking about. This particularity versus universality.
Hmm.
Uh, so Dasein, this enigmatic being, whenever we encounter this term and whenever we encounter this concept, we actually presuppose that yes, it is a sort of, Geist, and it moves, it runs through these the veins of the body of the universe, sort of thing. I'm just picturizing it. So
Hmm.
how do you define this? How many types are design out there? I mean, uh, particular, which design, which design, which one, which decides its existence on itself? It is just a
Yeah.
common and, the naive question, but I can't help asking it.
No, I like that. But the Heideggerian response might be he kind of flips it. Dasein has multiple modes of being, one of which is what Hamad just said, you just said, about other Daseins. There's a Dasein lit chapter. Other Daseins as other modalities may not be the Dasein that's raising the question of being. It's being is an issue for it. Temporality is its meaning. It's a primordial temporality about how do we even live this stretched nature of what's coming as pure possibilities, what we're always have always been because we were found in the world that comes with us. Decisions, as you said, possibility to be or not be. You just take them, you choose them, they're given to you, you neglect, you choose, you don't know, you're stuck. But somehow all the registers of Dasein also relate to these registers of temporality, the temporal ecstasies, as he puts it. But this Dasein here is not just the human raising the question of the meaning of existence and answering it through God or science, but this whole process that we have to go through to see what he means by Zorga and care, and not just caring about the things that show up for us in the world so we can compare ourselves to them, like a tool maker in the tool shed, uh, getting ready to work on a project. But you mentioned the other Daseins, and what he says there are other ways for Dasein to be other than. So he might say that there's this radical. I don't want to fast forward to the second part of the introduction, second chapter, sorry, which is what we're going to now, by the way. Section 5 starts chapter 2 of the introduction. When we get to part 1, it's division 1 and chapter 1 on being in the world. But here, if I were to fast forward to the end of this, you're going to get something so strange of a definition of Dasein once again. He calls it the most radical individuation of being as transcendence. Now, when we say individuation, that's like the squirrel burrowing into the hole, carving out a path. It doesn't know where the heck it's going, but it's doing it. No one else is doing it. And you keep on cutting and differentiating. Difference is like that too. You just, you're just, you might think, are you cutting away and shrinking down to a singularity of a 0 point where there's this infinite density of possibility to be uniquely what it is? Or are you, and don't put this in human terms, like there's some celebrity out there, or movie star, or I don't know, singer who said, I'm just trying to be so unique, so individual, so different from all the popular cultural ways of doing it that we're just so amazed by that. There's, that's not what he means by that, because he's linking it to this verum and transcendentum as a phenomenological problem. So, long story short, um, if you want to take the metaphor of you're born with a certain amount of time, let's leave science aside, like extending life or freezing us right before we die. So hopefully science will advance when we wake up in the future. They'll find a way for us to live. Let's leave all that stuff aside. We're just talking about the anxiety of being given, knowing that you've been given a certain amount of time. You don't know when death is going to occur. It's indefinite. It's certain. It's non-relational. It's going to happen to you. We can't switch places. I can't take your death. You can't take mine. And it's singular because of not only the approach to it and how we experience it and how we're going to make sense of it. All these are there. But he also calls this like this impending or coming up against, like you're coming up against something. And so if the metaphor is that you're handed a certain amount of time, and as Plato and everybody else says, from the moment you're born, that's when you start to die. And therefore, if you're going to think about it, all of philosophy is just preparation for death. Says that in the Apology. But the point is that you don't want to use these metaphors. You're finite in terms of your radical individuation because you're given a certain amount of time, clock time, biological time, calendar time, roughly 70, 80 years on average. Different countries have different rates, obviously, for different reasons. But it's almost like, okay, you're given a certain amount of time and you poke a hole like water in a bucket and you poke a hole in it from birth and it starts to drip. And it's just, you feel like it's empty. And that's how most people might approach it. And other people do it gleefully or they don't think about it. Or some people, like I said, are very anxious about it. And some people need to have their lives mean something. They need to leave something behind, not just having kids. It's one thing to do. It's a great thing to do. Just did it. But that's not the leaving behind. The leaving behind is coming back to yourself. I mean, giving a gift to yourself after you're gone. That doesn't make any sense. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I owe this to myself. I'm not just going to not be responsible for it. But the thing I'm giving myself is I'm not going to be around to have my cake. And I got to stretch this out and live it. And then he wants to radicalize that thing. And it's going to come down to this very bizarre sense of temporality. I can't wait till we get there. Not to mention, too, most human beings, you're born and you die. Maybe there's reincarnation, Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic, Islamic. Maybe there's resurrection. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about Dasein is being towards death. And by the second half, he'll say, oh, no, I forgot to talk about being towards birth. He's not talking about Nicodemus. Oh, Jesus, how can a man be born again? Can you re-enter your mother's womb for the second time? Jesus is like, unless he's born of the spirit and the water, he shall not taste the kingdom. So, and Heidegger's not doing that. But you need to have another sense of time because of its relationship to being, the very being of time, the very temporalization of being, however you want to think about the relationship. It can't be what we've been given to in this, from the universe or in the world now, through everything else everyone else says in terms of their sciences or their religions. That's that radical individuation. But he doesn't name it. Let's see. So I think for now, the best thing to do for yourself is don't define Dasein. Don't even say being there. And it's too quick to say Dasein is. But then how are we supposed to do anything? Well, it's philosophy, science of science. If you don't start with a subject that is inquiring in this thing or doing something, how are you going to do the dissertation, Zach? How am I going to do the next article? Is it going to write itself? We wish it did. AI notwithstanding, you and I are not going to use AI. And I don't use AI. I think AI is useless, but that's just my opinion. For my needs. I mean, I prefer to just, if I'm going to get something wrong, I want to be responsible in a pure Heideggerian sense. We'll leave it to something else. But yeah, you can't start with the subject, and that's going to make this project very hard, this discussion group. I think we're at 10:30, and I have to actually transition, speaking of time. So thank you. We're moving now on to the section 5 of chapter 2 of the introduction, and things are going to get really wild there. I think what you're going to enjoy seeing there is the actual conflation of theology. So here's science, and scientists may not think this, and they're ontic. He does this tricky move where he takes theology and metaphysical religion and makes them ontic to separate himself, put him, it's like some, let's call it a big question mark over here. But then I think these Derridean registers, the spiritual and the intentional, the return movement, absolute primordial living present, which is not just a passing present in terms of becoming past or future. And who would question an origin? Just think about that. Because you might assume if you question the origin of something, then you might think Derrida is being solipsistic. He's not. By questioning that something didn't begin, it doesn't exist. He's not saying that. The problem is that it exists without an origin. but it's not eternal. Hence the finitude, the historicity. Okay. Thank you all. We will see you hopefully in 2 weeks. And thank you for being here. Really, this is great. I know we're just starting, but we're going to move to more discussion, I promise. Okay. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.